I'm delighted to be able to support the amendments in the name of my honourable and learned friend, the member for South Swindon, that it is very important to get the balance right and not to worry too much about phantasms and fears that won't arise. It's worth recalling that the Federal Trade Commission in the 1970s decided to open, or was on the cusp of opening, a monopolies investigation into IBM for its monopoly in typewriters, and that in this area, where technology is changing so rapidly, an overzealous regulatory mechanism is more likely to damage and hold back innovation than to advance it and put it forward. Just think, over the last few years, of the names that have come and gone. Who now has a BlackBerry? We now think once again of BlackBerry as being a fruit rather than a mechanism for communicating. What about a Nokia telephone? In the 1980s, the Nokias made Wellington boots. They're probably now back to making Wellington boots as their telephone has come and gone and been overtaken. And that's the thing about this sector that we're looking to regulate, that there is a competition within it. It's not necessarily a competition of market share at any one particular time. It's a competition of technology that is evolving faster than people are able to deal with it. But there's also, I think, in this bill, perhaps a touching confidence, a touching faith in the competence of regulators, which is one I do not share. The Competition and Markets Authority, to which we are about to give very, very significant powers, has actually made a fool of itself this year. And not just a little fool of itself, but it made itself look a global laughingstock by its Microsoft, Activision, Blizzard ruling, where it blundered. It got it wrong, and all the other regulators in the world did something else, and then the CMA had to back down. And the story was, and this is quite important, Madam Deputy Speaker, is that the CMA was actually doing the work of the FTC, but the FTC had to meet a higher legal standard, and therefore was encouraging the CMA to make the bid more difficult because it thought the UK law would be easier to work around than US law. And this is why the amendments on the judicial review standard are so important. I would be in favour of a full merit standard. And I think it's very peculiar that the opposition, which is always happy to go to court to obstruct the government at any opportunity, to obstruct the government to carrying out the will of the British people, to obstruct the government when decisions are made by accountable ministers, wants unaccountable, unelected bureaucrats to have an arbitrary power, which I don't want them to have. I want them to be able to operate according to merits. And what does the DMU have to fear? Are they quivering in their boots that incompetent decisions will be overturned? Surely they should have faith and confidence in their ability to do things properly and competently, because if they do them well, they won't lose. And then this argument that the law is complicated. Well, yes, of course the law is complicated. So do we just hack down all the laws and give arbitrary power to whatever regulator, because when we go to court it's difficult and it's expensive? That is the fundamental protection of a free democratic society, is that there is the rule of law. And suddenly it's thought that because the tech companies have a bit of money, though others in this field have some money too, that they should not have the protections that the rest of us feel entitled to rely on. I think this is a bizarre way of looking at things, and it's why I think the protections should be proper and should be full. And I know more than anybody else love these companies, and it's quite an interesting conundrum that all these companies that we use every day, Google and Apple and so on, are not beloved by their consumers, but they are remarkably useful. And we seem slightly to be legislating on the basis that though they're useful, they're just a little bit vulgar, and therefore we should be a little bit snooty about them. And let's not be. They bring enormous benefits to our consumers, to our constituents who are consumers. They make their lives easier, they make them more efficient, they give them the opportunity to do things more productively, things that they weren't able to do before. And yes, because they do this, because they provide this service, they make some money at the same time. So I'm very supportive of my right honourable learned friend's amendments. I think new clauses 23 and 27 are very important because they bring accountability to the regulator. And I want to ensure that regulators are accountable both to ministers and to Parliament. It is worth bearing in mind that whenever a regulator gets a decision right, it is the regulator's praise and virtue and worthiness that is held up. Whenever a regulator gets something wrong, it is the fault of the Treasury bench. So I would warn the Treasury bench and the opposition Treasury bench, who hope one day, in the far distant future, probably beyond my lifetime, to be holding office, that at the point at which that sad day may come, they will want to realise that they want to get the credit for what works, not just the blame for what fails. And this is important for all governments at all times. And currently we have delegated things to all these random bodies who then, when they bungle, it's the minister's fault anyway. And that's why we want to have this accountability. There's also what I would call the Tesco Amendment. Now, the Tesco Amendment is one that my right honourable learned friend and I have written to ministers about, to say this bill, as it's currently phrased, would allow Tesco to be designated. Now, Tesco is not by and large a digital company, but it has a lot of digital activities. People may buy their baked beans or their Bath Oliver biscuits from Tesco's and get them online. And that potentially brings Tesco's within scope. And we've had a marvellous reply, and I look at my right honourable friend now as I say, there's a marvellous reply from the department, predating my honourable friend the Minister, who I don't think would have signed such a letter. Anyway, the marvellous reply says, don't worry, because the CMA and the DMU, they won't do this. We may be giving them the power, but don't worry your little heads about it, they won't do it. Now, this is bad legislation. It's bad structure to legislation. Surely we have learnt in this House, and let's hope that the other place has learnt it if we haven't, that when you legislate, what you put in law is what you think may happen. You don't put things in law that you don't want to happen in the hope that somebody out of their goodwill will not use that power. That is bad legislation, and it simply shouldn't be in the bill. There's been an amendment provided, and if it's not accepted tonight, should it be accepted in the other place? And this is something that's so important when we are scrutinising legislation. And it fascinates me, after the Labour Party's had a go at the government for evenings ending early, that there's only one backbench speaker from the Labour Party today on a bill running to hundreds of pages. We've had 3 already speaking from this side, but it's the job of the opposition to hold the government to account. It's not the government backbenchers to hold the government to account, it's the opposition. On a bill of this importance, one opposition backbench speaker, and a very admirable one it has to be said, and a very diligent one, but only the one who wants to come and diligently go through it, because this is what we should be doing. There's not a V sign coming from the opposition front bench. Madam Deputy Speaker, we will need to pass around the smelling salts if this sort of thing carries on. But we need to be going through at the report stage the amendments that have come in one by one and the details of the bill. And amendment number 178, the Tesco Amendment, is doing exactly that. It is looking at a flaw in the bill, a lacuna in the bill, and trying to close up that hole. And that leads to the construction of better legislation which will have a better effect in the courts. So overall, I think we need to make sure, as my right honourable learned friend has said, that we put the consumer first and foremost. It should all be about that. And that actually there is huge competition in the tech sector, not just to the market share, but to the fundamentals of the technology, which change and evolve in a way that leaves companies that don't keep up out of business. It's not like a supermarket where their share may go up by 1 or 2% over a year. It's where they go from having the predominant market share to hardly still existing as companies. That's how rapidly this sector has changed over recent years and indeed over recent decades. So we shouldn't be too worried about a lack of competition, but we should always be worried about the difficulties of the overmighty regulator, unaccountable to this place or to ministers. It's why I put my name to the amendments, and why I would urge the government, as this bill progresses, to keep on thinking hard about why you should put faith in a regulator to have any lower standard than full merits for any review, because surely the rule of law requires that people's interests are properly protected and they are not subject to arbitrary law.